And that is also how we learn and evaluate things. So just feel free to, in your inner mind, work with that. Something may hurt to hear and touch you to the core, but let it happen. Because it's in working with and understanding our own relationships that we learn how to understand and work with other people's relationship. And I believe that couples that seek counseling help is, it's a lot of the clients coming to counselors here too, isn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. To understand my model of working with, which is actually very simple, once you get it. You need a lot of information and insights first before you get the whole picture, right? But it's kind of like you need to understand the whole picture before the bits and pieces make sense. So it's a little funny situation. It's like a puzzle. Many of the bits and pieces that have to be put together before you really understand where I'm going. You see? But anyway, bear with me. Do not despair if you sometimes can't find the thread in what I'm saying. There will be time for questions. The marital relationship is the core of the family, the cell of society. It's the highly important subject for the well-being of mankind, the entire world. It's a relationship where we, more than anywhere else, hope to find that which can fill our life with meaning and purpose. It's about love. It's about feeling loved and about how to pass this experience on to others, to someone else. My basic position is that all troubled relationships can be saved and healed, at least in theory. Marital problems, the way I see it, are all about, if we want to make it simple, three things. One, misunderstandings. Two, idealistic expectations. And three, simply lack of tools and know-how of communication. Of course, as marital counselors, we run into exceptions, such as relationships that seemingly cannot be saved. But if that is because the relationship really is hopeless and impossible, or it's because we are not good as counselors, that is truly difficult to discern. It can be tempting to save one's pride in telling a couple that we can't get anywhere with that. They don't want to work on this, they don't want to be saved, and so, I can't help you. I like to try to always think, I can't do it, maybe somebody else could. So always to look at that if we can't save a marriage, how can we be better? Instead of labeling them as hopeless cases. Therefore, as a principle, I never recommend divorce. I see the marital relationship as a dynamic system that possible and unexpectedly can change anytime, no matter how serious it looks. There's a tendency for many to look at marriage as a thing, a static phenomenon, something you can have in the same way as you can have a car in the garage. And this is a mindset at work when some people ask or talk about that they have a bad marriage. And then they will sometimes come to the marriage counselor and totally seriously ask for his opinion, whether he thinks if it can be fixed or not, in much the same way you take your car to the car repair and ask if you can fix it. And this line of thinking is closely related to the understanding that marriage is an arrangement meant to give the two parties happiness and satisfaction. But that way of thinking itself creates problems, because it does not reflect reality or the truth. So for me, a fundamental part of couples counseling is to help the man and the woman to understand that they each are co-creators of their marriage. It's a very good idea to sow very quickly in the work, and then find ways how to pass that idea on is up to our counseling creativity. But it's a very important part to have that in mind. They are co-creators of the relationship they find themselves part of. Being married to someone living together means constantly affecting the other party and reacting to the other party's responses. It's ping pong all the time. Whatever you get or do not get is continuously affected by what you give and not give. The responsibility, I like to say, is 50-50. And I often challenge people that I say it's always 50-50. And I know many of you will immediately think of some cases where somebody is more mean than the other and can always say that and so forth. And we can discuss more about that. But as in the way you understand me explain marital dynamics, you will see there is something to it. But you will meet a lot of resistance to accept this understanding because it means taking on a big part of responsibility for the dysfunction of the marriage one has become part of. And the only way to avoid this responsibility is to blame the other person. And you can use lots of time and creativity to prove that the other one is the biggest problem. And so can the other one about you. So blaming and criticism are very significant symptoms of an imbalance in marital relationships and points towards where we should intervene. Since there always is such great resistance to take on one's own responsibility, it's important, of course, that we approach this touchy issue very gradually, very tenderly, very compassionately. And sometimes you have to be a bit tricky and compassionate. Blaming is a psychological mechanism that presents a very crucial barrier to healing of the marriage. So if we can crack that nut, everything else goes easier. As you will see from the handout I think you have gotten, I sometimes call this part of my work that I want to talk about a post-fall psychology, trying to understand why do we have all this blame? Where does it come from? We can find a lot of explanations in the family of origin, in psychodynamic theories, and I use that a lot, we are inspired, but why have they ended up being that way? That we have to look at what's the origin of dysfunctional families. I believe that when so many of the typical conflicts in a marriage can see, or sort of intuitively sense, the same dysfunctionality that unfolded immediately after the event, or the dramatic transformation that in Genesis is described as the fall. There's nothing new under the sun. Sometimes it seems so clear to me as if it was, when I sit with a couple, I can have the feeling I'm sitting right outside the Garden of Eden with a couple that was booted out of there just 2 weeks ago. It's the same thing if we look at it closely. And we don't have to get into the discussions about, was it really the way it happened? No. Is the science says blah, 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 this and that, and stuff John Paul II has made very clear that Genesis is not at all about a scientific representation of how it really happened. It's more about explaining the mystery of the relationship between male and female in its original beginning. So Genesis is about psychology between man and woman. What it was like to be the first man and the first woman trying to make things work, and why it went wrong. So whoever wrote this was a mystic that was allowed to look deep into a mystery of existence. That is the way we should look at this. So we don't have to get into all these discussions. Do you believe in Genesis? That's for kids in kindergarten. So I like to claim that in this light, the biblical account of man's condition and challenges in relationship has a lot to say for our profession, that it would be nothing less but unprofessional to ignore it. What professional person would like to be called unprofessional? As I mentioned, the psychodynamic theories help us understand the problem of adult life in the light of events that took place in the early childhood situation. But trying to look way back to Genesis and see how the whole thing unfolded is what I would call a theodynamic theory. Psychodynamic goes back to childhood. Theodynamic goes back to the origin of the family. As a scientist, I cannot and will not refer to Genesis an account of the truth, I just said. I can only say that our understanding of these relationships deepens in the light of the wisdom handed down to us in Genesis. It makes sense to our rational scientific thinking as a possible way of explaining it. Therefore, I will call the claims of Genesis a working hypothesis. All scientists need a hypothesis to work with. A hypothesis that attempts to explain what we're dealing with. And the scientific criteria for a good hypothesis is that it, in the simplest way, should explain most observable phenomena we deal with. And I do think that the Christian faith and worldview, beginning with Genesis, qualifies for this. Thus I say that while we as scientists cannot claim that the Christian faith represents the objective truth about creation, it's certainly legitimate to accept the hypothesis it offers as an acceptable idea of what the truth could look like. This way, I think, the Christian faith becomes a legitimate partner in the field of scientific investigation into the mysteries of man's social dimension. With me? Yeah? Nobody's throwing eggs and tomatoes yet. The interesting thing with Genesis is precisely the account that the human person began with, is created within the context of the marital relationship. The creation of man and the establishment of the marital covenant are inseparably tied together. Adam and Eve are not created as individuals. The creation account does not talk about creating man as either male or female. He created them as male and female. You may not have thought of that difference, because today we think, well, somebody's either a man or a woman. You know, was it a boy or a girl? I mean, it's okay in some contexts to have that distinction, but it's very important in Genesis as we create as man and female. Man and woman only make sense when seen as partners in a marriage. And the theology of the body is beautiful in elaborating on this point. And this bond between man and woman is meant to be an image of God. He created man in his image. As male and female, he created them in his image. So because marriage is meant to be an image of God, it is holy and a fulfillment of man's existence on earth. This is what makes marriage counseling so incredibly fascinating, because we are dealing with such deep stuff. In the beginning of my career, I avoided marital counseling like the plague. I couldn't stand the amount of destruction energies that people in conflict, they emitted out on each other. Because I was always caught in the middle of the crossfire, not really knowing what side to take, and I thought that both of them had very valid points about the other one. And if I risked my neck to side a little bit with one to get some things moving, then I could be sure of one thing, and that was that the other one never came back. So I had to learn the art of being on both sides without being ripped apart. It took a little time. And I still have to be careful, but I'm quicker at noticing. I can hear immediately if I sided a little bit too much, the other one is there at me right away. I say, thank you, you're right, I shouldn't do that. So for a long time I just stayed with individual counseling, but I became more and more clear that all individual issues, one way or the other, are related to relationships. And I do remember 20, 30 years ago, when the concept of dysfunctional family first came up, or was first introduced. A few of my clients, they had discovered that all of a sudden that they belonged to a dysfunctional family. They felt very bad about and ashamed of it because it was something bad, you know. And I thought that was terrible, and I did the best what I could to help them, and felt sorry for them. But as years went by, more and more people showed up that had discovered that they also came from dysfunctional families. And eventually the number grew so big that I began to wonder if I also came from a dysfunctional family, which I discovered I did. By dysfunctional, meaning not super bad, always, but always dysfunction in detrimental, unloving way that's not conducive for the development of love and compassion. And until that happened, until I began to saw that I had a baggage myself to deal with, I had really thought I had my acts together. I had studied psychology for many years, so I knew all about myself and how to raise kids. I was good at telling my older sister how all the mistakes she did. And so I really thought that I was in harmony and in balance until I had kids. When I had kids, I discovered I could lose it, I could be upset, I could be arrogant, I could yell over little things, and it was a shock to me. Because as a psychologist, you know how bad that can be, and you're trying to teach other people not to do so. It's terribly embarrassing. It triggered a crisis in me. I said, I got to pull myself together, and next day I just lost it again and yelled at some stupid little thing. And this was the time when I was approaching the Catholic Church and drawn into it and discovered the sacrament of reconciliation and had a deep, powerful experience of forgiveness for the guilt I had accrued about being a bad father. And a big principle to know is when you're full of guilt feelings, then you can't act lovingly. So the more guilt you feel, the more stupid things you'll make. So forgiveness is very important. And it was one of my first really powerful concessions. I cried my eyes out, and the priest was so moved he started sobbing with me. So but I was flying home, and I had new hope, you know. So it was all very sobering experience, and I got the courage to take on marriage counseling again. But then I began to wonder if all marriages maybe were dysfunctional in somewhat varying degrees, but always in detrimental ways. And I discovered a very interesting thing here, namely that each one of the troubled couples I saw in my counseling, they believed they were the only ones that struggled this much. Because to them, most other couples seemed to have their acts together, smiling so happily to each other all the time, or at least Sunday in church. Now, I was, as a marriage counselor, I was in a good position to also know these other so-called happy couples. So I knew they weren't that well functioning as things might look like. Not rarely did I see Mr. and Mrs. Ideal Family who needed counseling and sneaked in the back door to my office to get it, but were very ashamed of it. So this experience was so consistent that I really understood how ashamed people were when they couldn't make their marriage work. Especially within the Christian community, because there you're supposed to love each other selflessly, day and night, you know, all the time. And nobody can live up to that. Such an idealistic expectation of married people creates many more marital difficulties than we need. And how can we be so sure about that nobody can live up to it? Well, here again, I'm very inspired by the theology of the body and scripture, of course, because we are reminded through our scriptural wisdom, presented through theology of the body, that how it happened and why we ended up where we are today. John Paul II said one place very clearly, we have almost forgotten how to love. We may tend to think that about our spouse, but what about me? Does it sound sad that you almost have forgotten how to love? Maybe, but to me as a marriage counselor, it's great liberating news. Why? Because it means we can't help being in a mess. It means we all belong to a lineage of dysfunctional families all the way back to the first marriage that went dysfunctional overnight after the fall. How can we know that? That Adam and Eve are a dysfunctional family? Well, we know that the first couple had kids with serious mental, behavioral, emotional problems. One of them killed the other one. And that's a very serious sign of a dysfunctional family. You know, in the Bible, we only get the most needed short stuff. We don't hear a lot about all the other things. So it sounds like it was just that day when the smoke went straight there and his smoke didn't. That kind just went nuts and killed Abel. No, it was, I'm sure, it was the drop or the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm sure there was a lot of arguments and frustrations and bitterness and disappointments in the family just after losing blissful paradise and everything went smoothly. There's been a lot of arguments there, I'm pretty sure. It's up to discussion, but it makes sense to me. So, where can we go with this? There is no need for us to feel guilty and ashamed about our condition and repetitive failures. It's extremely important, what I'm telling you now. Should we rejoice and indulge in our dysfunction then? No, no. The message is this. Do not feel bad about it in a bad way. And by that I mean with guilt feelings and shame. That makes it worse. We should feel bad about it in a good way. And what do I mean by that? By changing one little letter in bad and write sad instead. Feel sad about it. Sorrow. Is that better? Yes. Because once we are freed from guilt feelings and blame, we've got to do everything we can to move out of those emotional states. When we can embrace the sadness instead, then we're freed up to long for love again. And when we are longing for it, we will start searching for ways to bring back love into our relationship, like it was in the beginning. We always long for the way it was in the beginning, because that's when it was the way it was supposed to be. If the mind and heart is clogged with guilt feelings and blame, there is no room for the noble art of longing. Longing is painful, yes, but it's good, because in longing there's direction. It points toward a meaningful goal, and there's hope. Longing, therefore, is a very important factor to me in my work with couples. When to introduce it can vary, but everybody has it in their hearts. But most people try to avoid feeling it because it's often associated with so much pain and disappointment from early childhood years. And longing is not popular in our culture at all. You know, it's all instant gratification and stuff. So it's sort of a key point in my work. I think it's good for you to have some of those. If people feel hopeless and distressed and not loved, many people say, I don't feel loved. I feel unlovable, and they are stuck in that pit. Even if they maybe are married to someone who tells them all the time, I love you and you're wonderful and all that, it doesn't go true. So what has happened there is that their longing is turned off. They have found sort of a negative peace with feeling, I'm unloved. If you can ask them there, do you long to be loved? They may sometimes say, why should I long for something I can't get? That's irrational. Yeah. Because then it just hurts too much to long for something I can't get. there we have to sometimes convince them a little bit. It's not whether you can get it or not I'm interested in, but what you feel. What do you really feel? Because if you don't dare feel what you really feel, you cut yourself off. So helping people long for something means they get in touch with themselves. And that begins an integration of their heart and their mind. Okay, then we can help them cry or sob because they long, it's painful, but that is good. It feels good. So when you start longing, you will also, when you can trigger that, and it is in the heart, when a person dares feel longing for love, then the person admits, I am actually lovable. You see that? Yeah. Otherwise you cannot long for it. It's easier said than done right here, but as a theme in the work, working in those areas, helping people to long for something. And not by this one, why should I long for something I don't get? Well, it doesn't matter. You want to be the one you are. And consistently, people feel more grounded when they dare feel what they feel. And then often they get love coming in. If you think, I don't get any love and I'm angry about that, or I don't feel lovable and stuff, then you do not inspire any love to flow your way. When I talk about this Adam and Eve stuff, you should see the relief and surprised look in many of my couples' faces. When in their deep distress, sometimes I throw in couples comments like, oh, don't worry about this, Adam and Eve struggled with the same thing. They immediately want to hear me explain more about that. Because instead of feeling like marital failures, alienated from all the other normal and successful marriages all over the planet, you know what I'm saying? They are immediately swept back into the communion of, well, not saints, but fellow failures. And that changes everything, to not be alone.
We are longing for a coffee.
What is it?
We are longing for a coffee.
We are longing for a coffee. And we can get it so we don't have to break down sobbing. Good. Thank you for now. We'll continue what in half an hour?
Half an hour.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Thank you. Olha, lá fora, só para esclarecer, lá fora estão uns livrinhos à venda, são todos da Teologia do Corpo. Se quiserem aproveitar as catequeses da Teologia do Corpo, é um livro pequeno, mas simpático e muito bom. E este livro novo, que está acabadinho de sair, que é um comentário à Teologia do Corpo, feito por dois professores do Instituto João Paulo II, e que faz um shift grande, passa da doutrina moral da Igreja para a doutrina social e põe a família no centro do pensamento da Teologia do Corpo. É muito bom, recomendo vivamente, e está mesmo acabadinho de sair, foi lançado no dia 18 de outubro. Ainda não está assim muito visível nas livrarias e foi um esforço conseguir tê-lo cá hoje, portanto aproveitem também. E estão também umas pessoas do Novo Banco que nos ajudou financeiramente também para ter aqui sim hoje, para podermos ter cá o Peter, enfim, as nossas ajudas estão ali fora, por isso é bom saber que houve quem nos ajudasse também. Agora meia horinha para aproveitem.